In this section, we're going to be working with terrains and creating exterior environments for our level. Specifically, we're going to look at terrain sculpting. That is, how the different tools we can use in Unity will allow us to bring together a complete exterior environment. So we're going to be able to carve out mountains, canyons, hills, valleys, lots of different kind of things like that. We're also going to look at terrain texturing. That is, how can we make our terrains look like they're made from real-world materials? How can we make our terrains look like they contain grass, rocks, swamps, water, and all that kind of interesting stuff. So let's get started. In this video, we'll see how to create a basic terrain object, and then after creating that object in the scene, we're going to look at how we can tweak some of the properties for the terrain object to fundamentally change its construction. This is a very important thing to be able to do going forwards when we want to kind of add more detail to the terrain and add complexity to our scene. In this section of the course, we're going to look at how we can create larger environments inside of Unity. That is, how we can start to build up things like mountain ranges, fields, deserts, and ground plains, how we can in fact build complete exterior environments. So for example, if you need to create a vast snowy landscape or a collection of mountains or a dense and dark forest, then terrain is going to be the kind of thing that we're going to need to use to do that. And Unity comes with some built-in terrain features that we're going to look at how to use, and we'll also consider some of the limitations of those features. What you can see in front of me here is a completely blank new Unity project. In fact, we have the default scene open here and the scene hasn't even been saved. And the first thing that I want to do is to create a completely new terrain object for the scene. This is going to act as a starting point for building up a complete terrain environment. So to get started, I'm going to move to the menu at the top and select Game Object, choose 3D Object, and from the menu here, I'm going to select the option that says Terrain. So I'm going to select that option. And as soon as I do this, several things happen. You can see this inside the viewport here. First of all, we get a new asset that is created down here inside the project panel. By default, this is called New Terrain. You can see that this asset has been added here. I can in fact select the New Terrain asset, and when I do, in the Object Inspector, we don't really see any properties for amending that terrain. I can, however, change the name to something more meaningful, and I'm going to be doing that straight away. So I'm going to choose Terrain, and I will simply say Exterior Demo and press Enter on the keyboard to name that asset something more meaningful than just terrain. Then also, if you take a look at the hierarchy panel inside the scene, it creates a terrain object that you can see listed here. And this object is really an instantiation of this asset in the scene. In fact, if I move to the hierarchy panel and I double click the terrain asset to select that and to frame that in the scene, you can see that object selected here. And when I do select the object, we have a range of different properties and components that are displayed inside the inspector here. Most importantly, we have the terrain component and also the terrain collider component. The terrain collider is simply responsible for making sure that objects like first-person controllers and player objects can actually stand on the terrain and move around, and that their physical collisions will conform to the topology of the terrain here. But if I move to the terrain component, we have many different tabs representing options for the terrain. And as soon as you create a completely new terrain, you should always visit this cog icon here to define the settings for this terrain. These are the basic construction settings, and these should always be specified in advance because they fundamentally change the way that this terrain object is constructed. If I scroll down inside the terrain component to the bottom here, you'll see that we get information about the resolution of the terrain. This defines the construction of this terrain mesh here, and how dense it is and how large it is in terms of vertices, edges, and faces. Importantly, we have these settings terrain width, length, and height. And by default, these are set to 500, 500, and 600, and these distances are measured in meters. So this is an enormous size. Now, by default, you're not going to want a terrain maybe quite that large, so I'm really going to scale down the size of this terrain. For the width and the height fields, I'm going to specify a value of 128. That is 128 meters. And for the height, I'm simply going to specify 256. Now, for the height field here, this doesn't represent the actual height of the terrain in the level, but it represents the maximum height that the terrain could possibly reach. So if we were to create a mountain inside this terrain by pulling up the mountain from this ground plane, it could not extend beyond the height of 256 meters. The total height of any part of this terrain is capped at 256. So in doing this, we've seen in this video how to construct a basic terrain object and how we can configure its basic properties